The day they cut the ribbon at the resort, champagne flew through the air and camera crews swarmed the scene, capturing every fake smile and staged handshake. I stood there grinning like an idiot, not because I was proud of what the HOA had built on my lake, but because in exactly 7 months, I planned to sell the entire place out from under them for hundreds of millions. When I first laid eyes on Maplewood Lake, it looked like something out of a painting you'd find in a dentist's office. All soft pastels, perfect ripples, and a kind of silence so still you could almost breathe it in. The lake stretched out in lazy, shimmering folds, ringed by dense woods and a handful of crumbling docks, half submerged in the mud like sleeping dogs. The air smelled like wet earth, pine needles, and something older, something slower than the rest of the world. I knew then I'd found it, the place I'd spend the rest of my life if I could. It had taken me 30 years of saving, brown bag lunches, skipped vacations, and working the shifts no one else wanted, but I'd finally done it. The property was modest, barely an acre with a thin slice of waterfront, a crooked old fishing shack leaning against the trees, and a dock that groaned sideways every time the wind picked up. But it was mine. No mortgage, no landlord, no upstairs neighbor stomping around at 2 a.m., just me, the land, and the lake. The man who sold it to me was Ed Whitaker, a sun-baked old-timer who'd lived there for 70 years and fished those waters with his father. When we closed the deal, Ed shook my hand, warned me about snapping turtles near the South Cove, and gave me one rule: respect the lake and it'll respect you. No mention of an HOA. Not a word. No fine print, no whispered warnings. It was just land, clean, quiet, and mine. The first few months were everything I dreamed. I spent early mornings in my dented aluminum canoe, drifting through fog that curled over the water like ghost fingers. Afternoons were filled with chopping wood and clearing trails. Evenings brought stars so thick and close it felt like you could fall into them if you stared too long. The only neighbors were scattered families, mostly older folks like Ed who nodded from porches and minded their own business. It was perfect, until the newcomers arrived. At first it was subtle. Shiny SUVs started kicking up dust on the old gravel road. Contractors hammered and sawed at all hours. Where there were once trees, oversized homes sprouted, massive decks, stone chimneys, and every last inch pushed to the waterline without a care. The new families wore yoga pants and designer polos, talked loudly about stock options and second homes, and strutted around like they'd discovered the lake themselves. Then came the whispers, talk of an improvement initiative led by a man named Bradley Keene, a smug real estate developer with a year-round spray tan and a habit of talking over people. Before we knew it, slick pamphlets were circulating, full of warm, corporate fluff about preserving our shared treasure and protecting sunny shores for future generations. But I read the fine print. Twice. 3 times. What they were really pushing was a homeowners association, the Sunny Shores HOA, with all the usual traps. Mandatory dues, weighted voting based on property size, and strict rules that would turn this place into a gated fantasy for the rich. Regulations now covered everything, from fence height to mailbox color, but the most outrageous change was the declaration that the lake itself would be considered common property under the HOA's management. At first I laughed. It sounded like a bad joke. My deed, and those of the old families around the lake, made no mention of any HOA, let alone one with the authority to seize control of a natural lake. The idea that they could just declare it shared property with a few signatures felt like a plot ripped from a bad TV movie. I refused to sign. So did the other longtime residents, at least the few still paying attention. But it didn't matter. Bradley Keene and his cronies had been busy behind the scenes, collecting signatures from the newcomers who now outnumbered us. Thanks to some obscure clause buried in the township charter, if a supermajority of lakefront property owners agreed to form an association, it could be applied retroactively to the entire community. And they had the numbers. They had the lawyers. They had the audacity. 2 weeks later, I got my first Welcome to Sunny Shores packet, a glossy envelope stuffed with bylaws, fee schedules, and a chipper note telling me my annual dues would be $3,200 and that my participation was both expected and appreciated. I tossed it into the wood stove. 2 days after that, workmen showed up on my shoreline without knocking. They hauled out lumber, concrete mix, and power tools. When I stormed out and demanded to know what they were doing, a kid barely old enough to shave told me they were installing a community fishing pier and public picnic area to enhance resident enjoyment of the lake, on my land. I called the township. They redirected me to the county. The county told me it was a civil matter, and I should work it out with my homeowners association. The following week, they installed a garish wooden sign by my dock that read, Sunny Shores Lakefront Park, residents and guests only. It felt like a slow-motion nightmare. Soon after, the first fine arrived, taped to my front door like a passive-aggressive gift. $504 for failure to maintain shoreline vegetation to HOA standards. Never mind that I'd been living peacefully there for months. Never mind that the vegetation in question was a patch of native wildflowers that had grown since Ed's grandfather's time. When I called the HOA office, a cheerful young woman informed me that all lakefront lots are now subject to new aesthetic regulations designed to harmonize the waterfront experience. I asked who had authorized the inspection of my property. She put me on hold. When she returned, her tone had shifted to clipped professionalism. You'll need to direct any legal challenges to our compliance department. Then she hung up. I tried reasoning with the newcomers, explaining that the lake wasn't theirs to divide and pave over like some suburban strip mall. Some listened. Most smiled politely and went right back to planning lakeside yoga retreats and wine tastings. For them, it wasn't about land. It was about status, about branding, about making their vacation home Instagram perfect at any cost. I tried to ignore it to stay focused on my quiet piece of the lake, but it was relentless. Every week brought another violation, another fine, another smug email threatening escalated enforcement, liens, legal action, even foreclosure. Then came the town hall meeting. Bradley Keene stood on the stage, smiling like he'd just solved world hunger, and made his announcement. Sunny Shores wasn't just building a community center. No, they were building a lodge on the East Bank, a sprawling venue for weddings, retreats, and lakeside galas. A gift to future generations. A boon to property values. And the location? Right next to my battered dock, my aging fishing shack, and my unwelcome, unyielding self. I sat in silence as the crowd oohed and awed over architectural renderings of timber beams, stone fireplaces, and wide green lawns, lawns that, by the look of it, would eat up most of the East Bank shoreline. No one asked what it would do to the lake. No one asked who would pay for the new infrastructure. No one asked how the HOA had claimed control of public shoreline in the first place. That's when I knew. This wasn't a fight I could win with protests, petitions, or appeals to reason. If I wanted to survive, I had to play a different game. So I went home, dug out my old filing cabinet, and started documenting everything. Every notice, every fine, every photo of unauthorized construction and trash dumped on my land. I took notes, made copies, Learned everything I could about property law, easements, covenants, and the difference between public and private waterways. I planted my feet in the mud and waited, because if there's one thing I've learned over the years, it's this: when the powerful get greedy, they always overreach. And when they do, all you need is the right piece of paper at the right time to watch it all come crashing down. For a brief moment, I wondered if I'd misunderstood. Maybe the community lodge really would just be a rustic meeting space for potlucks and bake sales. I wanted to believe that. But 3 weeks later, the illusion shattered. I woke to the low rumble of machinery, massive orange earth movers tearing through the eastern bank. Pines, oaks, and maples were ripped from the ground and piled into smoking burn heaps. Trails were bulldozed, replaced with flags and stakes creeping toward my land. My calls to the HOA went unanswered. Emails bounced back. When I drove to the new Welcome Center, a perky receptionist told me to file concerns with the Development Liaison Committee, in writing. It was like arguing with a brick wall and lip gloss. Then the pile drivers arrived, towering machines hammering steel into the soil to anchor the 3-story event center that would seat 500. Each strike shook my house. Dishes rattled. Geese fled. Debris spilled onto my land. Lumber scraps, fast food wrappers, even hard hats. Construction crews trampled across my lawn like I didn't exist. Strangers parked in my driveway. When I confronted them, they waved toward the muddy wasteland and mumbled that they had permission. From whom? Certainly not me. Each day brought new violations. Bulldozers carved trenches near my dock, sending muddy water lapping against the foundation. Chainsaws screamed from dawn to dusk. One afternoon I came home to find a porta potty planted right in my back lot, bright blue against the shredded ground like a cruel joke. I dragged it away with a rope and some choice words. Within an hour, a fine, $250 for unauthorized relocation of HOA property. I laughed. Then I crumpled the notice and hurled it into the trash. The fines escalated. $500 for failing to maintain their construction debris. $300 for noise. $750 for obstruction of approved development activities. It was Kafkaesque. They were fining me for the chaos they created. I took pictures, dozens, then hundreds. Concrete sacks leaking onto my shoreline. Torn plastic fencing tangled in the branches of my few remaining trees. Deep tire ruts gouged into the mud by backhoes that treated my property line like a suggestion. I sent it all, to the HOA, to the county, even to the local news. And still no one listened. Regulations covered everything, from fence height to mailbox color, but the most audacious change was the HOA's claim that the lake itself was now common property under their management. At first I laughed. It was absurd. My deed, like those of the old families who had lived there for generations, said nothing about an HOA, let alone ceding control of the lake. You can't just declare a natural lake common property, with a few signatures. I refused to sign, and so did the few remaining old-timers who were still paying attention. But it didn't matter. Bradley and his crew had already gathered signatures from the influx of newcomers who now outnumbered us. Hidden deep in the old township charter was a shady clause. If a supermajority of lakefront owners approved an HOA, it could be applied retroactively. They had the numbers. They had the lawyers. They had the gall. 2 weeks later, I received a glossy welcome packet stuffed with bylaws, fee schedules, and a chipper note declaring that my annual dues would be $3,200, and that my participation was both expected and appreciated. I threw it straight into the wood stove. 2 days after that, workmen showed up at my shoreline without so much as a knock. They began unloading lumber and concrete to install a community fishing pier and public picnic space on my land. When I stormed outside and demanded an explanation, a kid barely out of high school shrugged and said they were enhancing the lake experience. I called the township. They bounced me to the county. The county said it was a civil matter. I needed to speak with my HOA. A week later, they put up a sign beside my dock. Sunny Shores Lakefront Park, residents and guests only. It was a nightmare unraveling in slow motion. Then came the fines. The first was taped to my front door with blue painter's tape. $500 for failure to maintain shoreline vegetation to HOA standards. Never mind that the so-called unacceptable vegetation was native wildflowers planted by Ed Whitaker's grandfather. When I called the HOA office, a cheerful young woman explained the new aesthetic standards. When I asked how they were even allowed to inspect my property, she put me on hold, then came back cold and professional. "You'll need to direct any legal challenges to our compliance department," she said and hung up. I tried reasoning with my new neighbors. Some listened politely. Most just nodded and returned to planning their lakeside yoga retreats and cocktail parties. This wasn't about community, it was about branding, about status, about making their vacation homes Instagram-worthy. I tried to focus on my slice of peace, but each week brought new violations, new fines, new threats. Then at the town hall meeting, Bradley made his big announcement. Sunny Shores was building a community lodge on the East Bank, right next to my land, my old dock, and my stubborn refusal to play along. The room applauded. No one asked what this would do to the lake, or who would pay for the roads and sewer upgrades. No one asked how they had legally claimed the shoreline. And that's when I knew I wouldn't win this with protests or emails. I had to play a different game. I went home and started documenting everything, every violation, every photo, every intrusion. I studied property law, covenants, easements, and water rights. And I waited. Because the powerful always overreach, and when they do, all it takes is the right piece of paper at the right time to bring the whole thing crashing down. When the construction equipment arrived weeks later, I hoped I was wrong. I wanted to believe this lodge was just a glorified community center. But when earth movers began carving deep scars into the East Bank, tearing up trees by the root, and pile drivers began shaking my bones with every thud, I knew. This was a resort. A 3-story event center with a wraparound deck and seating for 500. My property was overrun with debris, fast food wrappers, lumber, even a porta potty I later dragged back to the construction zone myself. For that, I was fined again. The HOA fines became laughable. $500 for non-compliant construction debris, $300 for noise abatement violations, $750 for obstruction of approved development. Meanwhile, the garbage they fined me for had come from their own site. I tried contacting everyone, the HOA, the county, even the local news. No one cared. I tried speaking with Bradley in person once. He was supervising contractors near what used to be a glen. I asked if we could talk. He clapped me on the back and said, "You should be grateful. Property values are going to skyrocket. You'll sell that shack for a fortune." I told him I didn't want to sell. He just smiled wider. "Everybody's got a price," he said. That's when the propaganda began. Flyers full of stock photos, glossy brochures, glowing articles in the local paper about new jobs and economic growth. I became the villain. An anonymous quote painted me as a selfish obstructionist. Neighbors began avoiding me. Even the old families fell silent. For a while I considered giving up. But I couldn't. I remembered Ed Whitaker, the mornings on the canoe, the loons, the mist. This lake had survived worse than Bradley Keene. So I hired a lawyer, a hard-nosed man named James Hawthorne. I dumped a mountain of documents on his desk and he leaned back, smiling. "You might have something here," he said. And he did. Weeks later he found a land covenant from 1897, buried deep in township records, never revoked. It granted exclusive rights to the lake's access and resources to anyone holding the eastern shoreline from Whitaker's Bend to Cedar Hollow. My land. My deed. My rights. If the covenant held, James said, then the HOA's entire resort, its docks, boat rentals, even its events, depended on my permission. And they didn't have it. I could have stopped them right then. But James advised patience. If we sued now, they might pivot. But if we waited until the grand opening, until they had real money on the line, we could strike for full control. So I waited. I watched the resort grow. Fake rustic beams, manicured lawns, luxury packages. I smiled at meetings. I played the role. And when the grand opening came, I clapped with the crowd, smiling as Bradley gave his triumphant speech. Because none of them knew that buried beneath their shining new resort was a covenant over 100 years old, with my name on it. Within a week our legal filings were ready. Ironclad. Bulletproof. A quiet title action to enforce the covenant. Injunctions. Cease and desist orders. The storm was coming. And I was going to be the one holding the lightning rod. We launched a full-scale legal assault, challenging every easement, every dock permit, and every event license that depended on access to the water, without landowner consent. It was a coordinated strike, all filed at once, flooding the county clerk's office with a wave of litigation. Word spread fast. The local newspaper ran a cautious headline, "Legal Challenge Threatens Sunny Shores Development," and before long major outlets picked it up. Suddenly real estate investors across the region had their eyes locked on Maplewood Lake. That's when the offers started trickling in, first whispers, quiet inquiries from shell companies and law firms probing whether I'd consider selling. Then the real contenders came, private equity firms that specialized in distressed assets, regional hotel chains, even national resort brands who saw what the HOA refused to believe, that I controlled the lake. Without my consent, their glittering new development was just a ghost mall waiting to die. I stayed calm. I told James to ignore the early feelers. Let the rumors swirl. Let the pressure build. Behind the scenes, a bidding war ignited, quiet but vicious, like sharks scenting blood. Week by week the offers grew. 7 figures became 8. 8 began brushing against 9. It was surreal, intoxicating, terrifying. Meanwhile, the HOA blundered on, throwing lakeside weddings with illegal fireworks that terrified wildlife, hosting food festivals that left my shoreline buried in trash, launching boat rentals, yoga retreats, wine cruises, and concerts loud enough to rattle my windows. Every photo, every dollar, every glowing review became more evidence against them. Proof they were running a commercial operation on land they didn't legally control. I said nothing, just documented it all. Every trespass, every construction, every environmental violation. And when the numbers hit a point so obscene I had to reread the offer to believe it, I looked across James Hawthorne's cluttered desk and said, "Sell it." Because sometimes the best revenge isn't a courtroom drama. It's cashing a check so big your hands shake, then walking away as the empire built on your stolen land collapses behind you. The buyer was a national resort conglomerate, the kind with branded bathrobes and valet-only parking. They didn't just want the resort, they wanted the lake. They understood what Bradley and his little HOA junta never could. The true value wasn't in tasteless event centers or tacky boat rentals. It was in the water. The rights. The control. Signing the papers didn't feel real. Not even when the wire transfer landed, hundreds of millions of dollars, enough to buy an island or vanish forever. But the real payday came afterward. Within 24 hours, the new owners deployed corporate lawyers like a tactical strike team. Cease and desist letters hit every mailbox in Sunny Shores. All commercial operations were declared unauthorized. All access revoked. Events, rentals, concerts, canceled. Weddings imploded. Corporate retreats vanished. Brides screamed into voicemail lines. Executives demanded refunds. The marina shut down, boats chained behind locked fences. Bradley Keene lost his mind. He called emergency board meetings, begged county commissioners, fired off desperate letters. But it was too late. He had built a kingdom on land he didn't own. And the new king had no use for sentimental dreams. The HOA panicked and sued, claimed the covenant was fake, the sale invalid, my ownership a scam. But all they did was open Pandora's box. James countersued. Art. Depositions uncovered jokes about rigged votes. Financials showed embezzlement. Signatures were forged. Permits falsified. The media turned vicious, exposing every shady deal, every lie. County investigators swarmed in. Residents filed lawsuits. Property values collapsed. Banks refused to lend. Agents refused to list. Sunny Shores became a cautionary tale. The new owners picked the bones clean. Bought what they needed. Bulldozed the rest. The event center was gutted. The marina dismantled. The fake beach razed. Everything, fireworks, yacht club, plastic cabanas, gone. From my porch I watched it fall apart. Coffee in hand. A smile on my face. I was out. Free. Rich. At peace. Nothing they could do would touch me now. Bradley sold his mansion at a loss, fleeing in disgrace. The rest of the board vanished, broke, humiliated, abandoned by neighbors who once worshipped them. And the lake, my lake, healed. Slowly. Stubbornly. The geese returned. Then the otter. Then the fish. The trees grew back. Flowers bloomed. The water cleared until it mirrored the sky. Sometimes I'd paddle out early, mist hugging the lake, silence thick around me. I'd drift to the center and watch the ruins crumble on the far shore. Broken pavement. Rusted beams. A forgotten dream eaten by the woods. I'd smile knowing I didn't just win, I outlasted them. I buried them in their own arrogance. I turned their greed into my freedom. I had my land back. My peace. My life. Fishing rod in one hand. Coffee in the other. I watched the sunrise spill gold across the water and thought about Ed Whitaker. About patience. About knowing when to fight and when to wait. The breeze carried the scent of pine, and the ruins of Sunny Shores whispered behind me like a warning. Some battles you win with fire. Others by standing still and letting the world collapse around you. And I had all the time in the world.